Thank you very much, Dirk, and thank you all. It's always a pleasure for me to come back to Leuven, a city I like, and I've come quite a number of times, and I remember still with emotion a fantastic dissertation defense in which for half an hour we played with various furrows to be in the proper garb. I will never forget that. I'm trying to convince my colleagues at Penn that we should have this kind of clothes, but no, they are not ready to do it. And I'm also glad to be introduced by Dirk, to whom I owe a few nightmares, because given this topic of Sade, I had to plunge myself in Marquis de Sade, and it's at times a hard reading, I have to say. But today, my topic is both broader and simpler, and it has to start from, I'll talk about my own initiation into the theme, to which I have to say I was really introduced to via one person. Some of you know him, Kieran Ross, who teaches in Strasbourg, and who had a previous supervisor who had died, sort of inherited his dissertation, and he had, as a sort of helper, somebody some of you may know the name of, Didier Anzieux. And so that's how I met Didier Anzieux, who has written about 4 or 5 books in French on Beckett and the psychoanalyst. Anzieux, if you know the name, was a famous psychoanalyst who was not a Lacanian psychoanalyst, but who had a sort of history with Lacan, which is that he was the son of Marguerite Anzieux, who had been called Aimée by Lacan in Lacan's dissertation. And finally, when Didier, so it's one of the cases that, the rare case that Lacan documents quite amply in his dissertation, which is still not translated into English, but the little story is that when Anzieux went to see Lacan to become an analysant in training, either Lacan did not recognize the name or never said anything about the fact that his mother had been the famous case on which he had built his dissertation and almost original career. When Anzieux discovered it, he was furious and left Lacan and became a sort of virulent anti-Lacanian psychoanalyst. I presented the first version of this last year in Paris at the Maison de l'Amérique latine to a group of French psychoanalysts. They all believed that Beckett had been in analysis with Didier Anzieux. I said, no, he was in analysis with Bion. What? Beckett is a psychoanalyst? Yes, but what you see with Anzieux is that he recreates the sessions that he imagines Beckett had with Bion. Okay. They haven't read these books very, very carefully, but I'd like to say that retracing this entire history forces us to go into a web in which we have not only a number of interesting people like Lacan, Anzieux, Bion. As you may know, Bion was one of the rare psychoanalysts that Lacan praised consistently throughout his career. He went to visit Bion in England after the war, and he quotes him quite a number of times. But also people like Jung, who was an important factor in Beckett's evolution. And of course, with Bion, I wrote on this a long time ago. Bion's career, as you may know, he had a long career, but at the end of his life, he started writing novels, a trilogy called A Memoir of the Future, published in 1977, quite late. Beckett died a decade later. That is very Beckettian and strangely so. So, psychoanalysis interacts with Beckett's work, we know this, and I would compare Beckett with another modernist author, H.D. Hilda Doolittle, the American poet, friend of Pound, who we know was treated directly by Freud in the mid-30s, and it seems that both in Beckett's case and in H.D.'s case, psychoanalysis was instrumental in overcoming a sort of writer's block, one could say. We'll have to see whether we can say that the psychoanalysis Beckett underwent had been successful or not. That's one of the questions I want to pose. Let's go back to the beginning. Why did Beckett need to go see a psychoanalyst like Bion? This was in the Christmas of 1933. Beckett complained of various problems, panic attacks, sweats, nightmares, and a number of boils and skin problems, and he felt that his life had become miserable, and he went to see, thanks to his childhood friend Jeffrey Thompson, who had trained as a psychoanalyst in London. He went to see Bion. And Bion was not yet a psychoanalyst then, and what is interesting for me is that Bion had began by studying language and history, literature, and only then went to Poitiers for a while as a language student, and then qualified as a medical doctor only in 1930, and only in 1932, so 1 year before, joined the famous Tavistock Clinic that was, as you may know, the place where the sort of a group of Freudian and Kleinian analysts had gathered. He was a psychoanalyst in training, it is important to know. Here is how Beckett describes the treatment to his cousin, Maurice Sinclair. And we have a good sense of it. What I want to stress is that in the same way as with H.D., who documented almost on a daily basis what she told Freud and how she would meet with him, what Freud responded, and how Freud, in a way, geared the double series of psychoanalysis. She came twice to Vienna. With Beckett, thanks to the letter, we have a sense of how it worked concretely. 3 times a week, I give myself over to probing the depth with my psychiatrist, he called psychiatrist, which has already, I think, done me some good, in the sense that I can sleep a little calmer and that the panic attacks in the night are less frequent and less acute. But the treatment will necessarily be long, and I may have months more of it yet. I'm not complaining. I regard myself as very fortunate to have been able to embark on it. It's the only thing that interests me at the moment, and that's how it should be. For those things require one to attend to them at the exclusion of virtually everything else. So we have here a sort of classical case. We see that Beckett has grabbed the fundamentals of the psychoanalytic cure. First, he takes it seriously. He says it will last long, but he means in matters of months. It's a point I'd like to insist upon, because today, thanks to Woody Allen and many jokes on New York psychoanalysts, we imagine psychoanalysis to be sort of interminable process. It was clear at that time for Freud and for the Kleinians that the normal length of a psychoanalytic cure would be 1 year. That's what they imagined, more or less. And we see Freud in a number of cases, as with the Wolfman famous case, somehow terminating before the analysis was absolutely over. Here, Beckett, as he says, is happy to see that a number of symptoms have disappeared. At the same time, he wrote in French in a following letter, he spoke of a victory over the night, which is almost Blanchotian in terms. The symptoms did not disappear completely, as he complains 1 year later, in January 1935, but he is aware that it must be a sign that the therapy is progressing. Then, in March 1935, he has a certain idea of what's wrong with himself, and I just put one section of a very long letter that has been used by all the biographers since Bear and so on. It was with a specific fear and a specific complaint that I went to Jeffrey, then to Bion, to learn that the specific fear and complaints was the least important symptom of a disease condition that began in a time which I could not remember in my prehistory, a bubble on the puddle, and that the fatuous torments which I had treasured as denoting the superior man were all part of the same pathology. We realize here that Beckett understands finally that the symptom, which I think is a sort of key for a really psychoanalytic treatment, it is not the elimination of symptoms that counts, but understanding the root and understanding a certain history. And in September 95, he just documents the genesis of the novel he's working on, Murphy, while he was in analysis. Finally, everybody who's read any life or biography of Beckett will know this. Bion told him that he should accompany him to hear a lecture by Jung, which says a lot of the, let's say, personal, friendly interaction between psychoanalyst and analyst. So, he, as we know, Jung was talking about a little girl, about 10, who had died, and Jung concluded that she hadn't been born properly. This became a mantra for Beckett. For those of you who know, for instance, All That Fall, we have it quoted in it and in a number of texts as well. However, if we compare what Knowlson, Bear, and many others biographers say about this turning point with what we have in the letters, it's not so clear. Beckett doesn't feel that he has experienced a sort of sudden conversion to Jungism or to psychoanalysis. That's how he described the meeting with Jung. I quote, "His lecture, The Night I Went, consisted mainly in the so-called synthetic versus Freudian analytic interpretation of 3 dreams of a patient who finally went to the dogs because he insisted on taking a certain element in the dreams at the Oedipus position when Jung told him it was nothing of the kind. However, he lost his neurosis among the dogs, again according to Jung. The mind, and meaning of Jung, is, I suppose, the best Swiss, Rabaté and Rousseau, mixture of enthusiasm and Euclid, a methodical rhapsode. Jolas's pigeon, all right, but I should think in the end less than the dirt under Freud's nails." I want to insist on this letter because you can see here a certain irony facing Jung, very Swiss, very Rabaté and Rousseau, enthusiastic and so on, and Jolas's pigeon, if you recognize that name, it's an allusion to Transition, the little review in which Beckett had published a number of texts on Joyce and his first poems and first stories, and of course Jola, French, but trilingual, loved Jung, and you could say that Transition was a Jungian magazine, as it were. We can see here, surprisingly, that Beckett seems to prefer Freud to Jung already, I would say. Less than the dirt under Freud's nails, meaning that Freud is more interesting because he considers the dirt and the nails, as we maybe Beckett knew Freud's famous analysis of the Michelangelo's Moses, in which he says that the technique is by looking at little details that are overlooked, like nails, like fingers, and so on. And as you may know, if you know this text, Freud's analysis is in great part a reading of the movements that he recreates of Moses' hand going through the beard. And from this, Freud reconstructs a certain movement of the biblical figure. So, we know indeed that at that time already, Beckett had read some Jung from Transition, but also some Freud. And indeed, we have to consider the situation of the school to which Bion believed then, the school that was Kleinian, that was neither exactly Freudian nor Jungian. So, we see, of course, some of this as a result in Murphy, the novel that Beckett was writing at that time. There's a chapter in that novel, if you read it, and I'm not going to go too long about it, in which we have a description of Murphy's mind, and it follows a scheme in which you have 3 concentric circles, and in the middle you have the darker sphere of the unconscious. And one can say that it is connected with an author that Beckett was discovering at the time, Arnold Gollancz, whose motto was Ubi nihil valles, ibi nihil velis. Where you are worth nothing, you will want nothing. And this is how Beckett goes on. It was not enough to want nothing where he was worth nothing, nor even take the further step of renouncing all that lay outside the intellectual love in which alone he could love himself, because there alone he was lovable. And of course, it's a beautiful Latin echo, valles, velis. Valles means to be worth, to be in good health, and also to be happy in a sense. And wanting, velis, is the issue of desire somehow. Beckett at that time was sketching a grid that was very close to Bion. I would have to go into that, but in which he was trying to, in French, a text, very complicated text in French called Les Deux Besoins, in which he distinguishes between wanting and the wanting of the want, which in Lacanian terms you might say is something like desire, or in Lacanian term would be the distinction between need and desire. Okay. I assume that you have, if you have looked at some of Bion's books, you will know that Bion had a very complicated system of concepts, and he had what he called a grid as well. So, what is the link between Murphy as a psychoanalytic novel and Murphy as a philosophical novel? I think it is not just certain references to Spinoza. He speaks here of the intellectual love in which he alone could love himself, but it's also this idea that you have in Gollancz, who, if I'm not mistaken, must have taught some time in Leuven, I think, yeah. And so you have this kind of ancestor of the philosophy department here in Leuven, and I urge you to read Gollancz. It was really Beckett who, I don't know how he managed to discover Gollancz, but extraordinary writer. And as Beckett said, in Belgo-Latin, kind of Belgo-Latin, which I think is a neat phrase to describe his style. Of course, he was a Cartesian philosopher, and that's why he had a hard time in the region. And somehow he was, I think, very quickly given no tenure, and he had to go to another place, and so on. We know the things that still happen today. But what we can say is the philosophy of Gollancz somehow inverts the Cartesian philosophy of which he comes, from which he comes. And if you can say that Descartes' main verb is cogito, I think, for Gollancz clearly it is nescio, I don't know. And so this is why you have also in that sentence, ubi nihil valles, ibi nihil velis, a return of the nihil, which is stressed. And you may want or you may desire the nothing, which could be a key for Beckett at that time. And so this leads to Gollanc's philosophy of humility. I was struck by the fact that Nietzsche, surprisingly, had read Gollancz and saw him as an interesting link towards Schopenhauer. He didn't agree with Gollancz because what he saw in Gollancz was a philosophy of humility, humiliation, as it were, of the human, and this idea of having no power. What you find in Gollancz, I quote again, the action, wherein I have no power, therein I do not will, that's another translation of the same sentence, embraces both parts of humility. I have no power denotes inspection of oneself. I do not will denotes disregard of oneself. And so this is the very paradoxical idea you find in Gollancz, which was relatively common at the time in the philosophy of occasionalism. It's a whole book by Delattre on Malebranche and occasionalism. And the general idea is simple but counterintuitive. The experience that is always made by Gollancz is movements. And he shows that when I move an arm, I don't know how I do it. I want to do it, and then it happens. So I don't know the mechanism through which my neurons think in those terms and my muscles are connected. Therefore, I don't know how it happens. So the knowledge that is presupposed by Descartes doesn't work. But then he concludes that if I don't know how I can move anything, and if I move nevertheless, it must be via God's will. And so Gollanc's philosophy, you find this a little bit in Malebranche, and is not that far from that of Berkeley, is that everything happens because God wants it somehow. God transforms me into a little puppet and makes me act somehow. As he says at some point, I am a mere spectator of a machine whose workings I can neither adjust nor readjust. I neither construct nor demolish anything. The whole thing is someone else's affair, and this someone else is God as the only actor of my actions. So it is a philosophy, you might say, of pure passivity, of total impotence, and at the same time, of total grace. If you think of Kleist's famous later essay on Marionette theater, as Kleist explains, only marionettes have grace because they don't think. As long as you think, you lose that innate grace of the automaton somehow, the mechanism of the ineffable. And so we find this, of course, in Alain Delattre philosophy of occasionalism that shows that it's also based on a philosophy of unknowing, not just not knowing, and perhaps of the unconscious. See? Of course, when Nietzsche takes a look at this, he connects this with a religious philosophy, ascetic priests, which they will lead to enthusiasm, rapture, plunge the soul into an abyss only to let the subject want to be closer to God's presence. This is on the genealogy of morality, the passage from Gollancz. Take a look, because it's quite interesting that we know that Nietzsche had read Gollancz as well, and also, surprisingly, Freud had read Gollancz. At least he had heard about Gollancz through when he was a student and read a lot of philosophy. We can say that in Gollancz there is this idea that humility offers an initiation into this value of non-value in which you discover the unconscious. And we can say that this is something that I will want to tackle a little differently via an older encounter with psychoanalysis. And this will lead me to a book that I owe the discovery of to a strange book written in French by a critic called Bizub, Edward Bizub, who I never met, but he has a book in French that whose title is quite funny, Beckett et Descartes dans l'œuf, aux sources de l'œuvre beckettienne de Horoscope à Godot. Bizub, among other things, imagines that everything in Beckett derives from the first poem he wrote, Horoscope. I'm not going to bore you with this. We will need to take a long time to read that poem, and I cannot do it now. But among many details he discovers is that we have many sources used by Beckett about Descartes when he wrote this poem, that basically about Descartes' life. Baillet and Mahaffy, books he had read in Dublin and then while he was in Paris at the École Normale Supérieure. But then, so that's Bizub's discovery, that there's no doubt that Beckett had been inspired by a book published just a few months before he wrote his poem, called Descartes, le philosophe au masque, by Maxime Leroy. Okay. So I was curious and I took a look at this book by Leroy, published in 1929, 2 volumes, and I saw, it's not really mentioned by Bizub, that Leroy, who was a sort of journalist, you might say, a sort of socialist at the time, is trying to enlist Descartes in a philosophy of the left at that time, and showing that Descartes was always disguising himself. But fundamentally, what he did, he copied Descartes' dreams. As you may know, in Descartes' biography, Descartes had 3 famous dreams where he was in his poêle, in a soldier, and narrated, wrote down those dreams and then interpreted them to mean that he had to become a philosopher. Leroy copied those dreams, sent them to Freud, asking what Freud thought about them. And Freud answered to Leroy, and happily we have lost that letter. It's only what remains in Leroy's book that is a sort of testimony of how Freud analyzed Descartes' dreams, which I think is quite interesting. Of course, this is nothing extremely new. Freud says that he could not give a precise meaning, that he has to take into account the fact that Descartes already interpreted those dreams, so he cannot add so much to the interpretation, and that there is something like a melon mentioned at some point, and we may think that something that you find also in Ulysses, but that was written a little earlier, about a melon that is a sexual symbol, and that fundamentally what he shows in that analysis of his own dreams, he was undergoing an intellectual crisis. So, out of this, Leroy reconstructs Descartes and shows that Descartes was a divided person, somebody who was always at odds, contradicting himself, and for instance, as he was a rationalist, which is the usual term we employ for Descartes, he was also very superstitious. He believed maybe in the teachings of the Rosicrucians, and one sign of his superstition is that he never wanted his horoscope to be known for fear that people should have power over him, which clearly is the root of Beckett's idea of working on horoscope, because the horoscope as a poem is about the refusal of the horoscope and keeping the horoscope secret. And so, what I want to say here is that Leroy begins to read Descartes, I would say, psychoanalytically, even though he may not know much about psychoanalysis, at least he asked Freud, by probing the gaps and contradictions in his texts and linking them to Descartes' private life, his body, his erotic dreams, and the connection between the genius as a thinker and the slightly obsessed erotomaniac one could see in Descartes. Okay. So, we find this, of course, in the picture given by Beckett. It is exactly the picture that my friend Q. Lee, who has written recently a great book on Descartes, Reading Descartes Otherwise, Blind, Mad, Dreamy, and Bad. That's Descartes seen by Q. Lee. This is a little what we have in horoscope, in which one of the tropes is that famous story of Descartes talking about his ideal omelette, as apparently we know from a letter. Descartes would refuse to eat eggs that were too fresh, and they had to be 8 or 10 days under the hen, which puts Descartes in the tradition of what is called in Asian countries balut, when you eat an omelette with little bones, as it were, and little feathers even. Is one of the tropes of Beckett's weird poem about Descartes. The simple mention of this, which we discussed it a little bit, shows that this is another Descartes that he wants to show us. And I will not, again, talk so much about the poem, but this idea that we can say that this poem shows Descartes as a divided subject and a subject caught via the unconscious. How do we know this? It's one note that helps us. At some point, horoscope replaces the Cartesian motif of cogito ergo sum with its source, Augustine's, and so people who've read a lot on Descartes notice that Descartes took from Saint Augustine the same idea, si enim fallor sum. If I am deceived, I am. Okay. And so, fallor, I am mistaken, this deception is Descartes' malingénie, but it is also this abortion of the rationalistic system that you find here in the image of the hatched eggs, in which you can recognize aborted chickens. And we can say that horoscope, as a poem, unfolds the unthought of Descartes' rationalism. His fears and his death, of course, it's presented as a sort of meditation of Descartes as he's dying in Sweden, and we can say that it is a sort of Thanatos and Eros being linked together, and in a sense we can think back to a recent debate, and we can return to it if you want, that has opposed Derrida and Foucault on Descartes, in which in the history of madness, Foucault famously argued that Descartes eliminates the theme of madness by saying in the second, I'm not mad, whereas Derrida, I think quite rightly, this would be a long discussion, argues that the presence of the evil genie, the malingénie, shows that there is still this hyperbolic doubt that could be everywhere, as it were. And so we can say that if there is an irrational ghost in the heart of reason, we can say that Beckett's early Cartesianism is in fact a Freudian Cartesianism, which leads me, and this would take too long, but to the statement made by Lacan about the Cartesian subject. Against what has often been said, Lacan's psychoanalytic system is not without a subject. You need a subject in Lacan's system, but this is a divided subject that is nevertheless a Cartesian subject, which is more or less what Beckett would present us in his first poem. It is also connected with the theme of the impotence of reason, of not being able to think the cogito transformed into a nescio. And of course, we see this in Murphy, but Murphy, as we know, if you know the whole story, is the story of how Murphy, the young man, rejects his fiancée, Celia, to move into the psychiatric ward. And we know that Beckett, thanks to Jeffrey Thompson, took many, many notes on what he saw in one hospital in London, Bethlehem Hospital, and went to visit the catatonic, the schizophrenic, the paranoid, and so on. And somehow one can say that Murphy is also a story about the delusions of a young neurotic who imagines he could be happy by turning into a psychotic, and then realized, as he says, quoting Joyce, no, only God could do that. That is, only God could transform a neurotic into a psychotic, which is the last variation on the occasionalist theme somehow. This leads us to the question of the links between this constellation of images and Bion. And I would say that what to me is the most interesting in Bion is the idea of truth. There is always the question of truth, and Bion, who is somehow always a Kleinian, who is talking about the good object, the good breast, the mother, the infant, he always shows that what counts for the subject is to be able to have the conception of truth. And one of the main ideas of the early Bion is that if a mother, as he says, is not experienced enough and cannot dream, has lost the ability for reverie, then the function of truth will be lost. And there will be so this is the text of the theory of thinking. Then you will have a perverse couple of the mother and the child. And unlinking shows that you need to retrieve the question of truth, even though there is a presence of the unconscious. I will just leave it at that, because I think that this is not very far from the positioning of truth in Lacan's system, where the unconscious is, you might say, the key. So, we could say here that for Bion, there is what he calls knowledge, he calls it K, and O, that is truth. Truth is seen here in quite Lacanian or Badiouian terms as a whole through a certain discourse. See? And whenever Bion talks about knowledge, he also generally quotes mystics, and like St. John of the Cross, and you might say via negativa, a non-knowledge. What interests me as well in Bion is that one of the key ideas he has, which is not so far from Golinck's series of meditations, is that you can have thoughts without a thinker. And this is what will interest me in this one text I will use now, which is from an abandoned work, a text written in English, the first text written in English by Beckett after a long interruption. He wrote so many novels and plays in French, and then returned to English, and wrote this weird text that John Pilling has described as hysterical obsessional structure that seems at once to invite and discourage psychoanalytic interpretations. The autobiographical as autobiographical aspects of the text are obvious. There is the situation we find often in Beckett's first French short stories, like The Expert, The Calmative, and so on, in which you have a young man, you might say a son, to speak a little like Kafka, and the son is somehow expelled from the mother's womb and expelled from the house. This is what you have at the beginning. The son is rushing out, the mother is seen staying alone, wringing her hands in grief, and the son exhibits a strange Oedipal remorse because he feels he has killed his father. What is interesting as well is that it is among the many, many texts that have been abandoned by Beckett, and Dirk here knows quite a lot about these texts, and there are so many of them. It is the only one whose title highlights the fact that it has been abandoned, and it is, of course, a text about abandonment somehow. And what then we have is the progression of this son, who seem to be marked by a mixture of rage and guilt, desire and disgust, and it is manifested in his sort of paranoid relation to animals. And we can say that he meets birds that attack him, and then a horse, and then stoats, and all the animals seem to be aggressive, and meanwhile he is trying to go as far as possible from the house of his mother. There's a section even beginning with "enough of my mother" for the moment, and then the mother is transformed into a horse, a shimmering, like in white color, evoking perhaps milk, and while the son is trying to go beyond the Oedipal stage, as it were. And then you have this passage, "My father, did I kill him too, as well as my mother? Perhaps in a way I did, but I can't go into that now, much too old and weak." And so here we discover suddenly that the son has killed both the father and the mother. Of course, you could say this is a wink to Freudian, or as Pilling would say, a little too Freudian interpretations. But then at the end, you have that passage that I want to read because it's quite typical. The narrator, having managed to go to the end of his progression, somehow sinks into the earth as a Knonian world full of worms. And he meditates on worms. A ton of worms in an acre, that's a wonderful thought, a ton of worms, I believe it. Where did I get it? From a dream, or a book read in a nook when a boy, or a word overheard as I went along, or in me all along and kept under till it could give me joy? These are the kind of horrid thoughts that I have to contend with in the way I have said. Now is there nothing to her to this day, to the white horse and white mother in the window? Please read again my descriptions of these before I get on to some other day at a later time. What happens now is I was set on and pursued by a family or tribe, I don't know, of stoats. The most extraordinary thing, I think they were stoats. Indeed, if I may say so, I was fortunate to get off with my life. Anyone else would have been bitten and bled to death, perhaps sucked white, like a rabbit. There is that word white again. I know I could never think, but if I could have and then had, I would just have lain down and let myself be destroyed as a rabbit does. Of course, it's tempting to read in this weird animal, the stoat, not so common, that would suck him dry, something that if you know this very weird text called Wrath for Radio 2, and there's a moment when there's a scene of torture, and the animator tells the young, sexy secretary, kiss him, suck him white. And that has to do, of course, with sexuality. And clearly, the stoats sounds very much like thoughts that you would stutter on. And I would be tempted to connect this with the theory of Bion's theory of thinking. Daydreaming with animals in order to keep on thinking, but thinking with thoughts that you can catch, and thoughts that are allegorized by animals that correspond exactly to quote another title of Bion, wild thoughts. See, those wild animals become these sort of stoats, rabbits, horses, and so on. At the end of the text, we see Beckett abandoning the text, but also abandoning his own body, or the body in the fictional body, that we can see this. You can lie here for weeks and no one hear you. I often thought of that up in the mountains. No, that is a foolish thing to say. Just went on, my body doing its best without me. So this idea of the body functioning there, alone, as it were, without thought, and we have this again at the ending, in the ending of Ohio Impromptu. What thoughts, who knows? Thoughts, no, not thoughts. Profounds of mind, of mindlessness, whither no light can reach. So here we can again wonder whether Beckett's psychoanalysis has been successful. And I have to return to my initial mention of Didier Anzieux, because one of the ideas that Anzieux has is that no, the analysis was not successful. And Anzieux blames Bion, who was too young, inexperienced, like the mothers, and unable to achieve the real kind of transference, and in a way using Hume by proxy in order not to continue analyzing Beckett. The consequence for Anzieux, and it is a strong thesis, is that Beckett would have been in a way blocked, even though his writer's block had been overcome. He then kept on repeating the same scene again and again and again, see, in the plays and so on. Okay, I'm not sure that he is right, but this poses the question of the pseudo-couple, which is the invention of Beckett, and that we find most famously in Waiting for Godot, in which you have the two tribes, Didi and Gogo, and then Lucky and Pozzo, who arrive on stage and create a second pseudo-couple. According to Anzieux, the pseudo-couple is just a projection of the relationship between the analyst and the analyson in Beckett's case. And so Beckett would have multiplied those pseudo-couples. We see them in Mercier and Cagnier and many others and so on. Okay, so that would be the way, and then Beckett would have continued with the trilogy, but in the trilogy it's again, imagine that each time it is Beckett writing for Bion for this unfinished, abandoned, interrupted psychoanalysis. Okay, which of course would presuppose that good psychoanalysis would have perhaps had as a result that Beckett would not have continued writing, but would have been maybe happier in his life. At the same time, I think that, and I'm glad that Dirk quoted that passage from Kant and Freud, that we know that Beckett kept on reading a lot in psychoanalysis over time. And personally, I would say that his psychoanalysis had been successful, at least if I go back to my comparisons with H.D. When Freud treats H.D., she is psychotic, completely psychotic. Then she starts writing again. And Freud assumes that it is enough, that he doesn't want to cure her. And indeed, H.D. was not cured. She had 2 or 3 moments of quasi-suicidal temptations and so on later on. You could conclude, if you are severe with Freud, that he did not succeed curing H.D. I think he did. Freud was enough of, let's say, a detached observer to refuse seeing HD even when she wanted to go back to see him, and he would always ask, are you writing? Good, that's enough. The same thing could be said to Beckett, in a way, that even if he repeats himself in his writing, the fact that he could continue writing, even abandoning many things, is a sign that the psychoanalysis was successful, I would argue, personally. And even if there is a certain repetition, I would just argue this following the idea of a philosopher I discovered a few years ago, and I think can throw a lot of light on Beckett, Günther Anders. Günther Anders has a marvelous little essay, very short, on Waiting for Godot. And he shows that those two pseudo-couples in Waiting for Godot are not at all identical. And so, if they were caught up in the circuit of repetition, and just, as the idea that Vivian Mercier famously said, Waiting for Godot is a play in which nothing happens twice. But this is not exactly true if we consider, if you know the play, that everything changes when the second pseudo-couple intervenes, that is Lucky and Pozzo. Why? And so here I follow the analysis of Günther Anders, who shows that the first pseudo-couple is a parody of Heidegger's philosophy of time and being. They have being but no time, or they have time but no being, and they don't share a world somehow, and they are stuck in endless repetitions, and indeed funny jokes and banter and slapstick, but it could go on endlessly. Everything changes with the eruption, you might say, of Lucky and Pozzo. Why? Because as Anders says, with Lucky and Pozzo, we have the entire mechanism of Hegel and Marx and the philosophy of the 19th century, which is the philosophy of the master and slave. The irony is, of course, that with Lucky, we find a slave who feels lucky to be a slave and is happy of his own enslavement. This is, of course, Beckett's interesting twist. But as Anders says, just because of that, there is somehow the sense that history can still continue. You're not blocked in that repetition. This is a case where I think Anzieu's reading has been a little short and a little repetitive, and to conclude, I would say, I would wonder, why is it that Beckett's work is felt today to be so relevant, so important, and so on? And why is it that it has been performed in jails, it has been performed in Sarajevo, it has been performed in New Orleans after Katrina? You may know the work of Paul Chan and others. Why is it that this play, but not only this play, many other texts, and I would then here deduce people like Stan Douglas, who was inspired by Beckett in a number of works and so on. Why is it that Beckett's works that apparently signify very little, seem very nihilistic, pessimistic, and so on, are so relevant? It is because of that nexus that he discovered very, very early with the impotent and unknowing subject of this kind of Descartes, Gollancz, Freud, as it were. See, that's Beckett's genius. Later on, he systematized it by saying, well, I do exactly the reverse of Joyce, I am on the side of impotence, and so on. But it came very early, while he was still working with Joyce, as it were. And so this is, I think, the model of today's subject. The subject that I would call post-traumatic, who has survived somehow a huge trauma. And we can say that this is something that no other important modernist author has conveyed, in a way, even if you can find according to Deleuze and Guattari, in Woolf, something of the psychotic writing of the outside. Nevertheless, the relevance of Woolf to contemporary events and catastrophe seems a little more tenuous than Beckett. And in that sense, I would say that indeed it is thanks to Beckett's proximity to psychoanalysis, without necessarily having succeeded in his psychoanalysis, having understood that. What is the impact of the unconscious if you rethink the subject? And I think this is where Beckett can still touch us, and at least will continue doing so. Thank you.